Good evening, Davis. This is Jim Morosa, and this is A Republic Always, episode number 2. This is 2025. It's February 12th. I hope everyone's having a good new year, and things are looking up. So, I got a guest today, and what we're going to do is be going having an overview of the Constitution. There's just the big picture. What's the basic, details of the Constitution? Why it was written? Why we still have it? Why it's the longest living document to run a country? And then we're going to kind of do a little deep dive into the 14th Amendment and the advise and consent clause. We're going to just get into a little of that. We only have a half an hour, so we'll do what we can. So I have, like I said, I got a guest today. Her name is Catherine White, and I've seen Catherine's articles in several newspapers, especially like the Boston Broadside. I never met Catherine. It's the first time I met her. And she's got a very impressive resume here. She went to MIT. She was an engineer for 20 years before she decided to go out to business on her own, and she's a tax accountant now. But during all those years, she joined a book club, to read Cleon Sikowskin's The 5,000-Year Leap, which grew into a full-time career as a U.S. constitutional scholar, author, and lecturer. She's been lecturing at colleges from Brandeis to who knows where, and she's a teacher or an instructor at Camp Constitution up in New Hampshire, and she's been on the BBC series as well for a Almost Royal episode of Almost Royal. So without further ado, Catherine is here, and she's going to go over the Constitution for us. Catherine.
Okay, well, first thing is taking off from what you said about this is a republic. The difference between a republic and a democracy is that a republic is based on laws that no majority vote can overturn. A democracy is ultimately mob rule. If you can get just over half of the people to agree on something, they can do anything up to and including take away everything you own, including your life. Democracies are dangerous. Democracies devolve into tyranny. Democracies are absolutely not what the founders were trying to create when they wrote the Constitution. And the purpose of the Constitution was to take the principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence and make from those a functioning governing system for the 13 at that time states. The last thing they wanted to do was to create grounds for a new tyranny. The Constitution was written in 1787, just 4 years after the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War. That war was fought to free us from the tyranny of the Great Britain, England, King George, and the flouting of all the interests, whether it be personal or political, of the colonists. The last thing they were going to do was set something in place that was going to recreate those conditions. And if you actually read the Constitution from end to end, I mean, this is it, with all the amendments plus, fancy quotes and interesting tidbits. You'll see that the Constitution itself almost invariably addresses international concerns and the way the states interact with each other. It has almost nothing to do with the personal lives of the people. It was never intended to have any effect on the personal lives of the people other than sending mail, bankruptcy courts, and making sure that there were standards of weights and measures. Does that sound like the federal government we have today?
Oh, really?
No, not so much. Not so much. But whenever you look at or read the Constitution, keep in mind that they were trying to set in place a governing system to face the outside world as 13 unified states that had no effect on the individuals and that were there to protect the liberties of the people. Once you keep those in mind, everything else falls into place much more readily.
Well, that's awesome because, just like the Constitution you held up, which she gave me one and I had one, George Washington, they wanted him to be the king, and they wanted him to continue on being president. He said, no, only 2 terms. The government was designed to only have citizen leaders. That means that, when, when you're elected into office, you stay there for 2 terms or 3 terms, and then you go back to the farm and work it. When I hear things like, it's too complicated, you don't understand, Jim, we got to, no, it's very simple. It's very simple.
I have a lovely phrase that I use. The Constitution is written in plain English that can only be misunderstood by people with advanced degrees in law or English.
That's excellent. That's excellent. In fact, the Federalist Papers, which is just, it explains it. All this little document is explained because the people didn't want to sign it in the beginning. They were concerned about the federal government being too obtrusive, like the one they just fled from the monarchy of King George. They didn't want that, so they really had to be cajoled, and that's why they had added the 10 amendments, because they said, no, we're not going to sign it unless there's 10 things here that you're never going to touch. And that's all they're doing, especially that Second Amendment, boy. They can't keep their hands off that baby. But the focus of today is going to be the 14th Amendment and just how it was written and the whole history of this. It's very important that we look at the construction and the details. And this has a great quote in it, which I'll read before Catherine goes and dives into the 14th Amendment. It says here this is by Thomas Jefferson, on every question of construction, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted. Recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning may be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed. And that's what this is all about. This is why it was passed. This defines what it is, not what the screaming mobs in the street are doing now, because it's really bad what they're talking about. And that's exactly what Catherine said. Mob rule is all these protests in the street. There's one thing to protest. It's one thing to like the Summer of Love in 2020. But so Catherine, give us a little more detail on the Constitution and the 14th Amendment.
What else would you like to hear about the Constitution specifically?
Well, just whatever, anything that I said, just overview. But
okay. Well, I'll give you this the super quick information on the Constitution. Article 1 is on the legislative branch's rights and privileges and duties. Article 1, Section 8 is the areas where the states have given authority to the federal government to act. It's a very short list, depending on how carefully you parse it out. There's only 17 items where the states have given the federal government authority to act. Article 2 is on the executive branch. Article 3 is on the judiciary branch. Article 4 is interactions between the states and the federal government. Article 5 is methods to amend the Constitution. Article 6 promises that the new government under the Constitution, as opposed to the Articles of Confederation, would pay all the debts that the earlier government had taken on to fight the Revolutionary War, and they did. They paid them in full. And it also says, and this is going to be pertinent to what we speak about in a minute, this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof. And then it goes on. But please note that in pursuance thereof. That specifically means that laws that are made that are in pursuance of the goals and the limits of the Constitution. It doesn't mean anything that a crooked Congress can be talked into passing and an even more crooked president can be talked into signing. It means in areas where the Constitution has allotted power to act to the federal government, refer back to Article 1, Section 8. And anything else that they do is unconstitutional. It is a theft of power from the people and from the states, and it is, by definition of both Jefferson, Hamilton, and Madison, a usurpation of power not granted, and therefore, if the people and the states know the Constitution, and we don't have state governments that are complicit in betraying the Constitution, those acts would be null, void, and of no effect. And Article 7 is just the closing protocols and signatories and the rest.
That's right. As you're saying that, it just reminded me of recently there was an initiative by some constitutional, congressmen and senators to affix to every bill that Congress did the site of what part of the Constitution gave the authority for them to pass this bill. And they denied, they wouldn't implement it. They didn't pass it because most of the stuff they pass would not pass constitutional muster. It will pass, as she said, a bogus interpretation of the Constitution, but not the real interpretation. They're usurping power, bit by bit. But
instead, it goes back to what the Jefferson quote earlier, squeezing out of the text or invented against it. I'll also have people make note in Articles 1, 2, and 3, one of the first sentences says something about all powers shall be vested. Now, vesting is a very specific word, and it means that power is assigned to some person or group as their own responsibility, but to them specifically and without the authority to outsource it. So when Congress creates an agency out of thin air with no constitutional justification and then says, you go off and you make regulations that have the force of law and you can enforce those with arrests, with fines, with penalties, Congress has no authority to do that. Congress has authority to create an agency as an advice to them on areas where they may need to legislate constitutionally. They do not have the authority to say, we're creating you, you go do it, it's not our fault. They do not have the authority. There goes, boop, like a soap bubble, every agency operating as if it had force of law in the entire federal government.
And I think that's what DOJ is finding out. All those bureaucracies that they created that are doing all this work, they're not doing it for free. They're getting paid, and they're squandering that money too. But that's the bureaucratic government behind the government. It's very scary what's happening. And just to this point, I heard a little while ago that what's happening with like the DOJ, there's a lot of the states are suing with going to what do they call it, venue shopping, going to different judges to stop Elon Musk from doing certain things. But what they said was even these federal judges aren't really equal to the Supreme Court. When they say the branches are equal, that's the Supreme Court. That's the executive. The courts are the Supreme Court. The executive is the president, and the judicial is Washington D.C. Both Congress, the Congress and the Senate, not federal judges. That's what Catherine was referring to. They subbed it out to these federal judges to lighten the load for the Supreme Court. But these federal judges shouldn't be able to stop what the president is doing in his regular job.
They do not have authority over the executive branch. Furthermore, I would recommend to everyone that they read an article written by Carl Denninger on his Market Ticker blog that came out yesterday, February 11th, on how to stop this nonsense. And I'll simply say, it's fabulous, it's short, go read it. I'm not going to try and remember it. But one of the things that we meant to talk about today is the 14th Amendment, because it's coming up in so many ways here. And I'm just going to read just the very beginning here. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. And I'm going to mention that John Bingham, who is a Republican of Ohio, was the author of the original text of the 14th Amendment, and it did not have in the original text the "and subject to the jurisdiction thereof" phrasing. That phrasing was added by the Senate after deliberation on the amendment, and that phrasing comes very specifically from the book The Law of Nations, or Principles of the Law of Nature Applied to the Conduct and Affairs of Nations and Sovereigns, which was written by Emer de Vatel, and it was printed in 1797 in London. There are people who actually claim that the founders who wrote the Constitution did not know about the law of nations, because it's actually a basis for a lot of what's in the Constitution, because it wasn't printed in English until the early 1800s. The founders and framers were fluent in reading English, Latin, most of them in Greek, and everyone in French, because French, and I love this phrase, French was the lingua franca, which is in Latin, which means, well, English is now the lingua franca of the world. So English is the French language of the world in Latin, meaning everybody speaks it. If you wanted to be considered civilized and educated in those days, you spoke and read in French. So the fact that Law of Nations was printed in French is not a stumbling block here. But this subject to the jurisdiction thereof is crucial here, and it there's a lot that hinges on that. And in fact, I think, which of our quotes is it? It's the Law of Nations, Section 212. That's number 5 for Ben.
Yeah, Ben, picture number 5.
Thank you, sir. So the citizens, and this is from Chapter 19, Section 212, citizens, members of the civil society, bound by duties, subject to the authority, and they participate in the advantages. The natives or natural-born citizens are those born in the country of parents who are citizens of that self-same country. The society can't exist and perpetuate itself otherwise than by the children of citizens, and those children flow to the condition of their fathers and succeed to all their rights. Okay? The country of the fathers is therefore that of the children. These become true citizens by tacit consent. In order to be of the country, it is necessary that a person be born of a father who is a citizen, for if he is born there of a foreigner, it will only be the place of his birth and not his country.
That's
the end of anchor babies right there. Subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's why if you have an ambassador, our ambassador to Indonesia has a wife who has a baby while they are on duty in Indonesia, that baby is a citizen of the United States, not Indonesia, because the parent's citizenship is the United States. The same thing with children born to military personnel stationed outside the country. The same is true of diplomats in the United States whose children are born here. They are citizens of the country the parents are from. And any child born in this country is, by natural birth, a citizen of the country of which its father is a citizen, not where they happen to be when they are born. And that's the key, that's the crux, that is the foundation of international law, that is the foundation of the 14th Amendment. Born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That means you must be a citizen. It doesn't mean that if you're here, you obey the laws here. Well, that's a duh. Right? If you go to France on vacation and you break laws in France, they're not going to say, oh, he's just an American, you can ignore that. Right? No, if you break a law in France, you're going to be prosecuted and arrested and prosecuted and possibly face jail time in France because you broke a law. This is subject to the jurisdiction thereof as a citizen of the country. So a Brazilian couple here in the United States who have a child born here, they are subject to the jurisdiction and the laws of Brazil. They are subject to the laws of the United States as visitors, but their child is Brazilian. And this is where we then go on further in Vatel, picture number 6. The inhabitants as distinguished from citizens, are foreigners permitted to settle and stay. They are bound to society by their residence, subject to the laws of the state while they reside in it. Naturalized citizen is someone who is born elsewhere but has acquired the privileges of citizenship through a legal process. And vagrants, who are a lot of the people who are coming over the border illegally, are people who have no fixed settlements. And those born of vagrants have no country. They are still not American citizens for being born here. The purpose, and we can be done with the pictures now, the purpose of the 14th Amendment was to legally codify the status of all of the newly freed slaves and to acknowledge that having been subject to the jurisdiction as residents, that they were now being accorded the privileges of being citizens of this country where they had been living all their lives under a legal status that was now no longer extant. That's the purpose of the 14th Amendment. That's the only purpose of the 14th Amendment. You could say that the 14th Amendment doesn't apply to anyone anymore because there is nobody in this country who was born into chattel slavery as it existed before 1865.
That's a great deep dive because, and to your point when you started the show, that the only way to confuse it is to have a college education. I mean, it gets really tough.
Well, specifically in English or law. You know, if you studied plumbing or if you studied French literature, you have a much better chance of not mistaking it all.
In fact, if I remember correctly, we used to be a nation of common law, which was, whatever a normal, prudent person would do every situation is different. So when any issue went to the judge and the jury, what would you do in this situation? But now we're living under precedent and statutory law, which is like, oh, wait a minute, someone's trying to kill me. Is it okay if I fight back? I don't know. Let me check. Oh, I'm already dead.
That's the danger of law based on precedent. We don't have, there is no law school that teaches the Constitution as it exists and has not for over 100 years. I can't tell you the number of lawyers who've come to my talks or classes over the years who've later come up and told me, I learned more from you about the Constitution in an hour than I learned in all my time in law school and all my law practice since. But the danger of precedent, of law by precedent, is your first decision is here. It's in accordance with the Constitution. And the next one based on precedent is right here. And then the third or fourth one is here. And then the fifth one is here. And then the 19th one is here. And you get 250 years down the road. And your decisions are up here based on a nice string of precedent, but completely detached from the Constitution and the meaning of the entire basis of the federal law.
Ben, let's put up picture number 2. Okay, and this is what we're talking about. Thomas Jefferson knew about all this stuff. He said, enlighten the people generally, and tyranny and the oppressions of body and mind will vanish like the evil spirits of the day. We need to flip it and put up number 1. We need to, this is what it's all about. Thomas Jefferson warned us. He said, educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They are the sure reliance of the preservation of our liberty. We cannot keep our republic if we don't know what it is. And that's what this show and Catherine has been doing. We need to get back to the basics and find out what's going on, and we're running out of time. But let's try
and I'm going to castigate people generally just a little bit here. Most people, good conservative people who want to support the Constitution, will not take the trouble and the time to read it and try to understand it because they think it's too difficult. Please stop that. I see good people falling prey to one scheme, one proposal, one suggestion after another that is completely unconstitutional, but somebody says something that sounds good, and because they've never read and they've never studied, they have no idea what is in this, and they have no idea that the latest, greatest thing is actually completely unconstitutional and would harm what they want to preserve. Study it. It's not that hard. Unless you've got a degree, an advanced degree in English or law, in which case contact me. I'll tutor you.
Awesome. Let's see, the last minutes we got, we talked about we're going to try to hit the advice and consent, because that's what they're going through the...
Article 2, Section 2, advice and consent.
Yeah, because they're going through Trump's nominations, selections for the cabinet. And,
he shall have power, this is the president, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the Senate concur. He shall nominate, and by the advice and consent of the Senate, appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, other officers of the United States whose appointments are not otherwise herein provided for, etc., etc. What is the purpose of advice and consent? We come back to the purposes of the Constitution. The states are sharing some of their power as sovereign political entities with the federal government for the purpose of putting a unified front to the world. As such, they hold to themselves the prerogative of sharing who is going to exercise that power. It is the states who choose the president. It is not the people who choose the president. It's the states. So all this national popular vote nonsense, understand why we have an electoral college. It is the states sharing executive power. The states choose the president. It is the states sharing their sovereign power to make treaties and appoint ambassadors. Therefore, they have a say in who exercises those prerogatives. The president nominates, the Senate advises and concurs, or advises and then disagrees and the person is not confirmed. The purpose of the advice and consent is so that the states continue to maintain a modicum of control over exercise of power over the federal government that they created. There's a principle in law that predates the signing of the Magna Carta, which was very recent, it was in 1215, that the created entity is never greater in legal status, legal standing, legal power than that which creates it. It is the people and the states working together who created the federal government under the Constitution. The federal government is subservient, or is supposed to be subservient, to the states and the people, and the states and the people have the final say in all matters, not the federal government. Everywhere where the feds come in ham-handedly, they are usurping power they were never given. They have stolen power. The people in the states have to reclaim that, start locally, work up to the states, because the states right now are complicit in the theft of power from the people.
Amen. That's great. I mean, we got a deep dive. We only got 2 minutes left, but Catherine, that was awesome. You know, when you think about it, all these senators, you know, the Constitution did say that the governors were supposed to appoint the senators, and now they changed it so that we elect them. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because they're not serving the people, they're serving their party. Everything is done by political lines. And the Founding Fathers loathed political parties, okay? And they said that once we start getting to this point where we're at today, it's not going to be well for the Republic. And so we need to break this partisan stupidity. And, you know, we got the extremes on the left, extremes on the right. The truth is in the middle, baby. Let's get there. Stop all this partisan, hyper debates and stuff. It's crazy. But okay, I really appreciate you coming, Catherine. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And so we're going to have to do this again. But we're here, Catherine and I. You know, we never met till today, but we're on the same page as far as education. We need you, who's ever listening to us, you know, help yourself by helping the country. And we're going to teach as much as we can about the Constitution and how this country is supposed to run, the way it was designed, and so that we can all be free again. I'm going to do this show once a month, so we'll see you in March. And if you have any questions or anything, you can always call DCAT and let us know. If you want a copy of the Constitution, give them a holler. We got plenty. We'll give them out. And you got any last words?
Anybody who also wants to join a monthly class, send me an email. I have a website. It's constitutiondecoded.com. My email is catherine@constitutiondecoded.com. I have a monthly class. It's on Zoom because during all the shutdowns, there were too many people who moved out of state or decided they weren't going to drive at night anymore. So it's on Zoom. It's the second Wednesday of the month, which is like tonight. So I'll be teaching tonight. And anyone who is interested is welcome.
Thanks again, Kathy. Good night, Davis. This show is over.